everyone. Welcome back. Now, of course, we have our final talk of the day, our second plenary talk from Tony McEnery. Thank you, of course, to everyone who is still with us on Zoom, particularly those further east, where it may be quite late for you at night now, so we appreciate you hanging on for our final hour of the symposium. So our second plenary is, as I said, by Tony McEnery, who, of course, is able to be with us in person, which I'm very grateful. Tony is a distinguished professor of English language and linguistics at Lancaster University and Changjiang Chair at Xi'an Jiaotong University in China. He's published widely on Corpus Linguistics and is the author of at least 17, probably more, books. I could find 17 online, but probably more. Including Corpus Linguistics, Method, Theory and Practice with Andrew Hardy and many other excellent publications. I will say that Tony is also known as the founding director of the ESRC Centre for Corpus Approaches to Social Science at Lancaster University, and also for his work taking on senior positions at funding councils, including the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economic and Social Research Council, and it's also known for developing the very successful Corpus MOOC, massively open online course, which is in its 8th year of running, I believe. Yeah. Finally, before I let him get on with the talk, on a personal level, I owe Tony a lot, as Tony supervised me for my PhD at Lancaster. And so we went through it together and came out the other end. And it was great. I'm still recovering that, yes. Still in therapy. So no, I do owe him so much for your guidance and generosity and support during that period. And so I'm very grateful that you accepted our invitation to join us today. So I will now pass over to Tony McEnery to present Everyday Linguistics Towards an Epistemology of Corpus Linguistics.
Yeah, great, thank you, Robbie. And of course, Robbie, for his PhD, was a bit like little Jack Horner, but he stuck in his thumb and called out a 10 million word spoken corpus. Pretty good. So I was very pleased to be associated with that. Today I'm going to talk to you in a sort of vague and rambling way about what we think we're doing when we use corpus data. Really, that's what the talk is about. Let's see if I can make this thing work. So I'm always very interested when I see people describing linguistics as a science, for example. It's a marvellous label, makes things sound ever so important. But I think to myself, in what way is it a science? What is a science? Of course, one might say, well, it's some type of rational approach to language. There must be some type of process of science that I'm engaged in. And maybe I'm using numbers. Maybe that's it. Science is using numbers. Well, I'd actually say that science usually is about having some type of correspondence to reality. There's some reality that you have correspondence to. So if I'm a physicist, well, I'm looking at some type of natural reality and I'm trying to correspond to that. So maybe that's what we're looking at. But of course, that raises the question of what is reality? And I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about paradigms of research and how people can disagree on questions as fundamental as what constitutes and what is reality. And I'll be then asking the question which you're probably thinking already, what does the philosophy of science have to do with me? And the answer will be a great deal. And then I'll be talking about some work I've been doing with Václav Březina, looking at principles of corpus linguistics, i.e. an epistemology of it. An epistemology, a theory of knowledge, how we believe we come to know. What is the system by which we believe we come to know something? That's what this talk is all about. Let's see if this is working now. This is now working. Okay, good. So a common sense definition of science is something like science is the search for rational truths about reality. There we are. That's got me off the hook. I can leave the room. And then somebody says, wait there, what's this reality stuff? Tell me all about it. What are rational truths? Well, for me, I'd set aside a series of positions about reality which are very interesting to read about and fill philosophy courses up and down the country, like skepticism, idealism, relativism, skepticism. Well, I don't believe that reality exists. There is only one I perceive in my mind. Reality does not exist beyond it. I'm a very practical chap. And I'd say that's fascinating to read about, but clearly not true. Something fell on my head the other day. I didn't will it to fall on my head. I think there's some type of external reality interfering with my head when that type of thing happens. Relativism, we all have slightly different realities or totally different realities. To an extent, true. But if the thing that fallen on your head fell on my head, it would still have fallen on your head, even if you think your reality is different from mine. So I have a series of problems with these positions. So I take a simple, everyday view of reality, that it exists, but perhaps the way in which we engage with it, or may engage with it, may not be quite as easy as we think. That certainly was the view of one person, William Ockham, 13th century ecclesiastical and generally bright chap, and he identified two broad ways we can approach science. The way I've just been talking about, really, what he called scientia realis, where we're actually trying to engage with reality in some way and basing our view of science on that, as opposed to scientia rationalis, where we actually try to build systems of the mind, if you like, whereby we're modeling something. And we take it away from this physical reality that we can connect with. And of course, much work in linguistics since the 1950s onwards has certainly been in the scientia rationalis tradition, whereby people have reflected upon language, thought about language, hypothesized about language, abstracted language away from reality. And I was never personally very comfortable in that, though it's one way of approaching the problem. The way I'd approach it is through this scientia rationalis, realis. So what is this rational approach to language? Well, if we're going to take it, we need the means to collect and select appropriate data. So I'll say, okay, I've got this reality, language, and now need to go about collecting some of it. I need to collect and select appropriate data for it. I also have to have access to tools that are suitable for the investigation in hand. I suppose I'd need that. I also need to be able to discuss my work with other scholars and consult relevant studies in the library. I don't want to pretend that nobody's ever looked at this before, so I shall see what other people have said about it and try and fit my observations about this reality I construct for myself through the data with theirs and build upon their work rather than ignore it and simply replicate it, perhaps. And of course, we have to be trained to use the methods in question and understand the principles behind them. And this last point, I think, is the one where I want to say that corpus linguistics has been something somewhat lacking. We've never been very clear at times about the principles behind them. More of that later. Of course, the process of science, if we come back to it, what we're actually doing when we perform it, is very difficult to outline and is an area of huge contention. Here is a picture of Karl Popper, who a lot of my own views on this question are informed by. There are other theorists, and people may take their positions. But what you're hearing today is broadly informed by him and his work. And to put it simply, for Popper, a lot of work in science was about discovering, finding stuff out. That's what we're about. And key in his view of science was falsification, which I'm sure you've read about before in the corpus linguistics literature, because we often say this is one of the great advantages of corpus linguistics. We offer the opportunity to falsify and falsification. Why is it so important? Why is falsification quite as important as we might think it is? Well, in part because it allows us to divide out these two basic ways of looking at the universe, the metaphysical and the scientific. The metaphysical is not open to falsification, but it can still be useful to engage with, and it can still inform people's lives and even their research. I'll explain that in a moment. Science, on the other hand, to be called science for Popper, you have to be able in principle, to falsify something. If you cannot, in principle, falsify something, it cannot be science. It goes over into the realm of the metaphysical. So let me give you an idea. I've got this brilliant theory of linguistics. It's a metaphysical one, but I won't hold that against it, but it is a brilliant theory. And it's a theory which says that somewhere in the universe there is a creature. The creature is called the great interlocutor. And the great interlocutor decides everything we ever say. Now, that's my theory of language. It's all the doings of this great being. How do we falsify it? Well, actually part of the problem with my theory of the great interlocutor is it is not in principle falsifiable. You look under the table, it's not there. You look round the edge of the door, it's not there. You look on Mars, it's not there. You look on Jupiter, it's not there either. The problem with something that's patently untrue in that case is that it resists falsification. The less true something is, in some absolute sense, the more it actually is defensible, because you can't falsify it. So it's well over into the metaphysical realm. However, there are other things which are metaphysical, which you may be able to transit towards the scientific over time. It isn't that there's a giant brick wall between the metaphysical and the scientific. Many things can actually go through what is actually a relatively porous boundary between the two. The metaphysical may become scientific, and the scientific may itself become metaphysical. Let me give you an example, and it's a super easy one for this audience. The idea that we might want to look at words and look at very large volumes of them, hundreds of millions of words of them, isn't a new idea, and people had the idea long ago in the past. You can go back and find Arabic grammarians trying to gather small bodies of evidence and base their theories on them. But they could never really operationalize corpus linguistics as we understand it, because it was technically impossible. But over time, the development of technology transitions what is essentially a metaphysical approach to the study of language to being scientific. Bucer creates his concordances on punch cards. John Sinclair develops his corpus. Jeff Leach does his work. All these other people. Eventually, the thing starts to transition across from being metaphysical to scientific. Rather than being something which is quite a nice idea, but absolutely impractical, utterly undoable, it becomes scientific. At the same time, you can go back through history and find scientific positions put very boldly, which look absolutely real, until something in terms of technological development pushes them across to being metaphysical or nonsensical or just untrue. So ideas, for example, that if human beings travelled at more than 40 miles an hour, their lungs wouldn't function and they'd suffocate. At the point in time when the human race couldn't travel more than 40 miles an hour, you couldn't actually demonstrate that this was untrue, but it was firmly held as a scientific belief projected out of what people knew about the human body. But as soon as you tested it, it falsifies, and at best it becomes something that's metaphysical or simply untrue. So there's a relatively porous boundary between the two. And migrating sometimes is the most important thing that researchers can do. They take something which is essentially metaphysical and they migrate it across into the scientific. Again, think of something like the work of Fred Jelinek on speech recognition using corpus data. Essentially, it's a sort of metaphysical idea that if we actually ignore linguists and instead try to model speech purely as an engineering issue, and then use all of these ideas from Shannon and Weaver and people like that in order to use statistics to model the acoustic properties of language and actually try to do speech recognition that way, well, of course, the data isn't there. It's an innocent fancy until Fred Jelinek does it and demonstrates that it can work. At that point, this idea about the application of some ideas from engineering to linguistics transitions from the metaphysical to the scientific, and with very positive and long-lasting effects. Okay, so what do researchers actually do, and what do linguists actually do? Well, they work with both the scientific and the metaphysical. They have to. If they're going to transition things to the scientific, they have to understand the metaphysical, and many hypotheses that we might develop may initially begin in metaphysical land, and then we seek the ways of transitioning them across into the scientific. I'll go back to little Jack Horner. The idea that our view of spoken English had become outdated because we were relying on a spoken English data set for British English that was 20 years old was probably defensible. It was metaphysical because we couldn't quite prove it, but it was defensible as a claim. But the only way to actually then investigate that fully was to build the corpus. That was the thing that transitions the work that you might do on that from the metaphysical through to what I would call the scientific, because you're able then to actually study these changes relative to the previous data set with the new data set. Maybe it's imperfect, but it's better than nothing. So science can rely on metaphysics, and sometimes science can look deeply metaphysical. There is nothing, as far as I'm concerned, that is more metaphysical than the concept of dark matter, which some of you might have heard. This is where you have, in a theory, and you can work on this maybe in this sort of rationalist way I talked about before, a series of predictions about how the universe is going to work, and you discover that parts of the universe aren't working in the way that you thought they would, and the only answer according to your system is a substance which, A, makes up most of the universe, B, nobody has ever seen. Now this for me is a deeply metaphysical observation. We've never seen it, but it is by far the majority of matter in the universe. Every time I read this, I think, wow, I believe in this stuff. It sounds utterly untrue. Our theories are right because most of what exists we haven't seen. But that's exactly the type of work which pushes along work in theoretical physics, a metaphysical observation arising from the system that they've applied to the universe. The humanities as science, can the metaphysical become science from the humanities? Well, it does, and a lot of work in linguistics has demonstrated that. As we engage with corpus data, we start to influence the way in which people have looked at or modeled language, for example. So all of us can focus on reality, but reality can be of different sorts. You can have a metaphysical reality, a sort of imagined reality, a sort of leap of imagination reality where you make bold conjectures and say, well, I can't prove this at the moment, but I believe the great interlocutor is actually responsible for everything we're saying. And what we need is somehow to develop a great interlocutor detector. And once we've done that, we'll be able to prove my theory. I wouldn't recommend applying for funding for that one. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have physical reality, a very hard correspondence to reality that we can hold all of our theories to. So if I theorize that something like that table isn't particularly solid and I could walk through it, I can test this because the physical reality will push back against all of my theorizing when I fail to go through the table. And that's very helpful indeed. And indeed, at times, some of these metaphysical ideas look like that. There's a very interesting example recently looking at neutrinos and the search for this sort of flavorless neutrino. And they built a giant experiment in America based on this metaphysical idea that there's this fourth type of neutrino, and they didn't find it. So actually, reality pushed back at them and said, although your models would love to find this thing, it doesn't seem to exist at all. But then between the two is something I call social reality, which of course is where a lot of what we're looking at in linguistics actually lives. There is a physical element to it, the brain, etc., speech sounds that you're hearing, physical evidence in writing. Yet also beyond that, there are a whole range of factors which influence the way in which language is used, which really we don't have a handle on, but where we can find lots of telling examples of it at work. And we've heard some this afternoon, for example, in the paper on power, where a whole range of relationships and things actually seem to influence and make the nature of power itself in language shift as we went across different contexts, for example. Or at least that's how I read the paper. So the social reality is different again. The social is not the same as the natural scientific. The immutable atoms, etc., that we've just demonstrated ourselves exist, and these physical properties aren't quite the same in the social and aren't quite the same in language. If I look at a word as though it's an atom, I try and apply the natural sciences directly to linguistics, well, eventually it will all fall apart because we know that that word, for example, that I'm looking at, is infinitely more mutable than the physical property that we might look at. The hydrogen atom in this room, I dare say there are some, is the same basic thing as the hydrogen atom on Jupiter, as the hydrogen atom on Alpha Centauri, etc. It's far from clear that the word hydrogen, for me, is the same as that word as represented in your mind, your mind, your mind, etc. it's a fundamentally more mutable thing, and tomorrow there's no guarantee that its representation in your mind, your mind, your mind, your mind will be the same as it is today. And the social is mutable. That's what makes it really interesting to study, and what for me pulls it away from science per se and more towards social science. Okay, so what is reality? Well, it depends on your reality, and it's not necessarily agreed upon. For example, with physical reality, if you're wed to a particular theory, you may perceive a finding with another theory to be of no benefit to you, as it's based on a different view of reality. So, for example, again, I've given two examples from dark matter and people's reactions to the observations which made the necessity of creating that possible. If you believe in MOND, modified Newtonian dynamics, you have a model of the universe which says we can account for those observations within this model. If you're a follower of the dark matter view of the answer to this, you say, well, actually, we have a model that's not like yours, and we believe that accounts for the data. One of the failings, I think, sometimes in linguistics is the belief that somehow the data will determine the theory. If you can get the data to fit the theory, this is a proof that that is the theory to follow. But in fact, it's long been established in the sciences that data itself is theoretically underdetermined. The data isn't going to give you the answer. It may eliminate certain theories by saying it doesn't match the data, but we should expect to find several theories, or at least more than one, that could in principle match the data. So I think we should always be open to the idea of looking at a range of theories. And it's just the same with the social. You can theorize the social in various ways. So if you like, your reality as embodied in that theory, the social, may vary permissibly. Of course, metaphysically, you may dispute another physical reality, but then any work in it may be of no interest to you at all. So if you're a believer in Christianity, work in Islam may be of no interest to you whatsoever, because you have the model of the universe in your metaphysical view of the universe. Or if you're deeply committed to the idea that astrology is a real thing, you're not interested in other people's ways of predicting the universe, because your little metaphysical niche is the way of finding out that tomorrow you'll win the pools, and when you don't, you explain it away by saying that Saturn was in the wrong house or something. Okay, but ultimately, actually, part of science and research in general is the struggle between realities playing out. Different realities as embodied within theories, competing, working with the data, sometimes being falsified, sometimes being modified, sometimes changing. But I've mentioned that a major engine of change in the system is the challenge to a paradigm. And here I come to the work of Thomas Kuhn, who of course gave us quite a different view of science, because his was more sociologically oriented. So rather than trying to puzzle through the basic elements of it like Popper did, Kuhn's view was sociological in the sense that within these large areas, metaphysics, science, etc., you had paradigms. And I've just started to describe some of them to you. So if I'm really invested in modified Newtonian dynamics, that is a sort of sociological reality in a way. And if somebody comes along and tries to persuade me to shift to another view, they're trying to shift me out of my paradigm into theirs, you'll get reaction to that which is sociological as much as intellectual. People will say, no, I don't want to change. A good example of that actually comes from Corpus Linguistics. Somebody, I can't remember who it was the other day, it was Jack Reeve actually, online, put up a tweet about how easy or hard it was to reach out to other disciplines or other people in other paradigms, as I put it. And I actually told him that, well, I agreed with something he said, and actually I found over the years to do that type of thing, you need an incredibly thick skin, because it isn't simply that you walk through the door and say, excuse me, Mr. Generativist, I think you're wrong. Look at my data, it proves you wrong. In fact, it proves Chomsky wrong. So now you will all agree with me, and we'll work in this paradigm. They turn around and say, no, we are invested in this paradigm. We can think of very good reasons for carrying on in this paradigm. And then they come out with an explanation you think, that doesn't actually refute what I've just said. So, in other words, you start to come across sociological issues in the paradigms. People stay within the paradigms because they're invested in them. Or sometimes they fail to move to a new paradigm, and Kuhn identified this as an issue, because the investment in retooling to do so is so great that you get this inertia within their view. And certainly, again, earlier in my career, I experienced people not wanting to do corpus linguistics because they didn't do computers, or they didn't want to program, or they didn't have the maths. All of these questions. Non-answers, really, to the question of why aren't you doing it? Okay. So what does the philosophy of science have to do with me? Hopefully, you've thought that what I've said so far is amiable enough. It's kept you entertained at the end of a long day. But are you convinced it has anything to do with you? Let me try and push that point further. Well, I'd say if you're at a symposium like this, it should have everything to do with you. Whether you view yourself as being a scientist or a social scientist, or even a great believer in the great interlocutor. Because it informs the choices which determine and shape what is taught to you, for example, and what you may teach, or how you do the research, and what you consider to be appropriate research when you're reviewing it as a grant reviewer. You will carry these beliefs with you because, in part, your paradigm represents to you an epistemology, a way of understanding, a way of knowing, a theory of finding out. And you're wed to that, just as much as other people may be wed to theirs. So again, in research, it positions what you do and how it shapes and positions your research. I see a research question and I start to think of how I would approach it from within my paradigm. Different colleagues in the department Gavin and I are in may look at it and think of different ways of looking at it. So it informs exactly what we do. So we're all making decisions about our reality, our paradigm, and whether or not we're working within a paradigm or attempting a paradigm shift. Am I talking to other corpus linguists? That's one way of doing my research. Or am I trying to talk to a generative grammarian and convince him of what I'm doing and convince him to shift paradigm? As I've said, this can be enormously difficult. I remember one at a university I shall not mention, I remember giving a talk at the university about corpus research, and they had a 3-line whip on their departmental seminars, so everybody had to come. And one of the people who came along was a very prominent generative grammarian who didn't want to come along. So he made the point that he didn't want to come along by bringing a stack of marking with him, sitting on the front row and going through it as I spoke. So you need quite a thick skin if you're going to engage in shifting people between paradigms. I did have a victory. I made him laugh once with one of my points, and it was an intentional laugh with rather than laugh at, so that was good. But you need, nerve to do this. It's not easy. Kuhn had a point. One of the criticisms of Popper is he makes it look so easy. You just wander in saying, falsified, and they say, oh, well, we give in, and they move off. Whereas Kuhn pointed out that's not the way it works. There's a sociological dimension. But this idea of migrating from the metaphysical to the scientific to the metaphysical, this is important too, because it really is the stuff that exciting research is made about. Work within paradigms, as Kuhn calls it, that's actually usually what I view as slightly less interesting when I read a grant proposal than when I see something where somebody is trying to push something in one direction or the other, push it out of the game or bring it into the game. They're risky grant proposals, I accept that, but they're usually the ones that make me sit up and take notice, because I think this is something new. This could actually be quite big. So, as I say, if you're doing that type of thing, you're part of an enduring human enterprise, the struggle to work through and challenge paradigms, plotting out the shape of thought and belief, and a possible critique of corpus linguistics that its epistemological position has been drawn quite informally, typically. I'm working on a book at the moment with Václav Brzezina where we're trying to be more precise about that, and I'll introduce you to some of the reasoning on it in my last 15 minutes or so. I have to go fast. And that's what we're trying to do. We have thought through some of these positions, but to actually say that we have a fully worked through set of statements, if you like, that would explain exactly what we think we're doing when we're using corpus data, exactly how we think it reveals knowledge to us, exactly what reality we believe we're engaging with, I can think of few examples of doing that. I've written about a few of them. Michael Stubbs actually is probably one of the people who've tried to do that most clearly. Wolfgang Teubert actually, in his 10 principles that he came up with years ago, tried to do. I didn't agree with those, but hats off to him for being clear about it, because we're not clear about it, we cannot disagree with one another. And disagreement actually lies at the root of progress in this case. So let me give you some things to disagree or agree with. What we've been doing in our work is going through and trying to draw out what we're at the moment calling principles of corpus linguistics. I won't give you all the reasoning behind these today, but we've been working, as I said, largely in the framework established by Popper to try and do it. To try and work out what our epistemology is, at least Václav and I, and we think usually by extension quite a number of other corpus linguists too. Okay, so firstly we think that when building a corpus or using one, corpus linguists use research questions in order to engage with their data in a structured and controlled way. We think that people approach data with a question in mind, select the data with the question in mind, and conduct their research on that data with the question in mind. Why we thought this was an important principle is that often you'll hear the likes of Chomsky or people of that sort of Cartesian heritage talking about us just aimlessly collecting data. You know, he says, oh, you could just video record anything you like, it wouldn't give you a theory. Well, I agree with him, actually. I don't think it's a very good basis for selecting and analysing our data. And it's exactly what we don't do, is what I'd like to say to his face. It's exactly what we don't do, which is why we put it as principle number 1. But what we do say is the study of observed language is a means by which language can be investigated and explained. So we think this is a fruitful way of investigating and explaining language. Corpus linguistics also, in the form of corpus annotation, is an area where what we might call, and I'll explain this, the ontological presuppositions of linguistics become plain and apparent. Ontology, how we chop up knowledge, if you like, and label it. If I've got corpus annotation, that's entirely crystal clear. I'm sharing my ontology with you and my analysis in each case of how I might say, for example, assign each word to that ontology. So part-of-speech tagging, I'm making a commitment in my data to 2 things. 1, the part-of-speech tag set. I'm saying that part-of-speech tag set is the ontology of parts of speech. And then for each individual word in there, I'm making a commitment to knowledge and saying, and that word there fits into the ontology here. The word dog, in this instance, in this context, is a singular common noun, something like that. So that's good too. I'm sharing my reality with you. 4, because we have a presupposition of reality, so it's something that we start with, we're starting with the belief that reality exists, and we're going to go out and find it, and we believe we're going to find it somewhere in this type of thing that you're hearing now, or that type of thing that you're looking at up there. We're able to measure our hypotheses against observable, relatively objective data, and we're able to use the apparatus that's been developed over centuries to support inductive reasoning, for example, through statistical analysis. So we can lean on an enormous body of work in statistics that allow us to make inferences on the basis of this type of stuff or this type of stuff. Relatively objective data. Why don't I just say objective data? Go on, Tony, be daring, just say objective data. No, because it isn't entirely objective. Now, there are elements of it that are. We've all been trained in various ways, so there are various things where we can get some type of intersubjective observation going to say that that word up there is presuppositions. And we'd all agree that that word is presuppositions. So maybe at some basic levels we could say there is a hard reality which we've all been taught about those funny shapes up there and how they correspond to sounds that I might produce to say what they are. However, our reading of sentences and our beliefs about what they mean and our beliefs about what the other person intended get us sliding over to the metaphysical side of the scale very quickly. And there we leave objectivity behind, relatively speaking. We may be able to argue in favour of one or another interpretation, but there are ranges of interpretation, and sometimes those ranges of interpretation are exploited by the speakers, exploited by the hearers for effect. So I say relatively objective. And a big one, by studying corpora as finite samples of language, we can make general claims about language itself, which is probably finite in the sense that you could say, well, somebody started talking it in the past, and at some point in the future, the sun goes supernova and we all stop. So I suppose we could actually count it up. I said, well, in principle, it may not be finite in terms of the number of sentence forms it could produce, but in terms of it being collectible, maybe if we had enormous powers, time travel, etc., we could collect everything that was ever said. But that still isn't everything that could have been said. So there could be an argument about that. But what isn't arguable is that we're using fractional observations of language in order to make large inferences about the vast numbers of sentences that we never observe and we never hear. Now, in our work, as we go through it, we actually carry on with our reasoning and sometimes go back and change little statements that we make. And one that we did change over time was to actually say that by studying finite samples of language bound by space and time, we can make claims about language itself with those claims by space and time in the same way as our data. Now, that's quite a contentious statement. We've got to take space and time into account because we know that language varies across social space, we'll call it. If I could stop time now and study language right across the planet and just say, well, I'm going to make it easy for myself. I'll study English. You say, which variety? Which variety? There's variation across the varieties. British English. Okay, who's British English? If I studied it in Newcastle, it would be a little bit different than if I studied it in Bristol, etc. We know there's variation across space. Time, well, I always get quite interested when I see people making grandiose claims on the basis of corpora which really represent a drop in the ocean in terms of the time over which human languages have been spoken. So yes, it's great to do the work, and I think it's marvellous it's done, and I support them in doing their inferencing, etc. But I'd always put just slight hesitation on any of these findings, because even if we look at something like Google Books and accept it's a corpus, but here we accept it's a corpus and look at it, it's still a fraction of what's possible, even for those hundreds of years in which we can see the data. There are lots of languages not present, and of course there's a chronic underrepresentation of speech, which of course is the primary mode of language which we acquire as infants typically and use throughout our lives. Of course, the danger with this is some people will always want to make claims beyond the bounds of space and time. So they'll look at, say, for example, the lob corpus, then they'll look at FLOB, and then they'll look at BEO6, and they'll say, and I've seen this trend, and it will continue. I will escape the bounds of space and time at this point and say, 10 years from now, it will happen again. Or 20 years before it started that sequence, this happened. Now, the reason we call these things principles rather than rules is that actually we're quite elastic in our application of them. If people want to do that, fine, but they should realize in doing so that there are some limitations that come in through the door. When they're making a comment about what will happen 20 years from now, they are engaging in a comment that is essentially metaphysical. It cannot be falsified until we get 20 years from now, when they're usually quite silent about what they said 20 years ago, and they start making comments about what will happen 20 years from now. Simple example of that, estuary English. Apparently I should be speaking it by now, according to people who made the predictions about the spread of estuary English in the 80s, and I'm not speaking estuary English. Now they're talking about multicultural London English or something like that instead. Maybe they'll be right this time, but rarely do you get them going back over their cases and saying, you know what, we were wrong, and we were wrong for these reasons. And they should, I would always say, in these contexts. So they're called principles because we realize that people will work with their elbows to push outside the bounds of them at times, but they should be mindful about what they're doing in doing so. Good, there is still some time. Okay. Okay, that one probably won't surprise you given everything I've said already. And corpus linguistics promotes and is based upon an intersubjectively observable approach to language in which results are repeatable and replicable. So we've talked about intersubjectivity before and how we can approach some of it using corpus linguistics. So what we can do, and what we cannot do in terms of intersubjective observation, we cannot do through corpus linguistics. So if somebody said to me, okay, when Gavin looked at Principle 7 there, what did he think? And how did that inform what he said about this later on? Well, these sound like quite interesting questions. I think I might ask him later. But I cannot see into his head through corpus linguistics. There would have to be other methods used in that case. Okay, so there's that there. Repeatable and replicable. Well, repeatable, yes. Corpus linguistics really should be repeatable. I should be able to take a corpus, like the BNC 1994. I should be able to look at it and say, this word occurs this many times after I've told you what my definition of word is, or the definition of word as per the system that looked in the corpus. And you should be able to take those definitions, go back to the data and say, yes, it did occur that many times. I can see why he said that. I disagree with his definition of word. And actually, I would say there are this many, in fact. But I can see exactly why he said that. So it is repeatable. I'll give the old fool that. But he's actually got counting words wrong. Okay, so you might say that. Replicable, on the other hand, is a much more interesting question. And it's one which corpus linguistics has only sort of bumped up against from time to time. Replicable is not necessarily repeatable. What we're looking at in replicability is taking the same finding on the same type of data and seeing if we can reproduce it there. So rather than using the BNC 1994 for an observation, when I say it occurred this many times, and by the way, that makes it the most frequent modal verb. You say, okay, what word was that, Tony? I said, may. Right, well, we'll go to this corpus here, the lob corpus, which was collected around the same time. That also claims to be general English. And we'll see if may is the most frequent word for the modals in there too. That's replication. We're taking a similar body of data and seeing whether an observation actually carries across it. Replicability can get more complex than that. But that's exactly how I'm going to use it for the moment. Just that simple observation. It's not just repeatability. It's actually taking that observation based on inferences and seeing if all of those inferences work when you have similar data and you look at it, similar in some way. Of course, the replicable is very common in science. So people say, okay, well, they injected Mike for COVID vaccines, and we've seen this level of antibodies in his blood. So that means that if I inject somebody like Mike with this, that will happen. So rather than saying, well, let's inject him again and see if it's true tomorrow, they say, okay, well, now we'll go and find Ramesh. We think Ramesh is a rough match for Mike. We'll inject Ramesh and see if the same's true. And if it isn't, they then say, well, is the slight difference between Ramesh and Mike important? That's replicability. And there's very little of that that actually goes on in corpus linguistics, where we say, okay, well, we found this in the BNC, and in this other version of the BNC that doesn't exist, oh, right, okay, it doesn't exist, so let's not do it, which largely tends to be the approach. So the point about replicability and repeatability, I think, is an important one. In any investigation of corpus data, interactions between data and theory occur. This is quite a sort of thorny question, because of course sometimes people present corpus data as theory-free or pre-theoretical, etc. But undoubtedly our view of the data and how we approach it implies some type of theory or view about language, etc. And you'll get interesting interactions between the data and the theory. A very obvious way of seeing it is actually in applying different annotation schemes. One of the things I used to do with my undergraduate students many years ago when I first started lecturing was to actually, alongside corpus linguistics, introduce them to a range of theories of grammar. And each week we'd take the same data and then analyze it from the point of view of that theory of grammar. And you get different interactions between the theory and the data. The data never determined the theory. Not once did we turn around and say, so that theory is discounted because we can't account for our data. That theoretical underdetermination I talked about was apparent. I'm running out of time. Okay. So one of the other messages I think that we need to put across is corpus analysis does not necessarily pave the pathway to certainty. It's a problem-solving exercise and requires a constant engagement with new problems and the revisiting of old problems. Some element of certainty, of course, we can get because it is repeatable in part. So I can say to you, there are this many words in here, and this is how I define a word. You do the same. Yes, that's repeatable. That's certain, if you like, some type of certain knowledge. But plenty else isn't in the least bit certain. So back to my little example before, I say, I've looked in the BNC, written in 1994, and the relative frequencies in ordering them out of the modal verbs are as follows. In third place, we have can. In second place, I can do that, and it's true for that data. But in terms of this being certain about language, that inferential jump of not just talking about the boring little collection of language you have that we're not really interested in, we're interested in language, well, I'm not sure it's true. I can act as though it's true and say, therefore, in British English, this is it. But somebody goes off and they create another data set that looks a bit like that one. They decide to replicate it. And they say, well, actually, we got a different result with that data. So actually, you can't be certain that what you're getting from your inferences are certain and true. So we need to go around and revisit knowledge that we have and make sure that we still believe it. We need to test it rather than simply accept it, and we've done rather a lot of simply accepting. So far, of course, I've closely linked corpus linguistics to processes of induction. Describe this very roughly as sort of working out from the evidence that you have. And also entails the problem of induction, which points towards uncertainty. One of the problems of induction is presupposition. You have to have pre-existing beliefs about what you're looking at before you get to analyze it, and the pre-existing beliefs themselves can determine that, and then you can get into these sort of awful recursions where you now have to have pre-existing beliefs, your pre-existing beliefs, and etc., that type of thing. So that's quite interesting. But I still think that a corpus is of use for testing the falsifiability of a hypothesis about language. This is especially true, for example, in the example of inverse existential statements. If somebody tells me, and this is actually one of the things that usually irritates me most and gets me going for the corpus fastest, that X is simply not possible in language. I think I had one online recently. In fact, I had one in it was an appointing panel I was doing in Spain, and I'd used the sort of they pronoun as a sort of singular gender-neutral pronoun. And somebody wrote and said, oh, you're very woke using it like that, aren't you? You're spoiling the pronouns of English. And I said, I don't think that's true. But it never happened in the past. Of course, looked at Igbo, and you find lots of lovely examples from the 1600s of that pronoun used in exactly that way. So, as an example of falsifying somebody's claims about language, this pronoun use did not exist in the past. You can look at the corpus data, and as soon as you find examples where it does, you say, yes, it did. And you get these powerful falsifications when you look at these inverse existential statements. Existential statements, on the other hand, although I know Anatol Stefanovic disagrees with me on this point, but I think he's wrong. Existential statements are still very difficult to prove with corpus data because it's finite relative to the size of the language that you're looking at. So you haven't seen an example of something in 100 million words, so you'll say, oh, well, your claim that this is a word of English is not true because it's not in the BNC. And you say, it's only 100 million words of data. Most of the words in there have a frequency of 1. It's highly plausible that in the dangling tail off, if you like, beyond this data, it exists. Okay. Well, it'll all be solved is usually the answer when we have even more data. Well, it won't necessarily. It could well be somebody's idiolect, and it is a word of English for them, and it's never going to be in your corpus. Or it was a word of English 100 years ago, and that's not in your corpus. Or it was a word of English maybe 100 years from now, somebody will use this word. So I find proving existential claims of that sort through corpus data problematic. Okay, but I'll just go back and modify claim 6 based on what we've said in 7.11. because the experience must be tested, this scientia realis must be tested with respect to principles 7 and 11. We need to do it in a way that is as intersubjectively observable as possible. We need to consider repetition, we need to consider replication, and we need to consider exactly how we can use corpus data for falsifiability. Unfortunately, I've run out of time, but I'm going to skip all of the other lovely slides that I've prepared for you today, which you're going to weep about, of course, in order to get through to the very last one. See, there you are. If you can speed read, you can get the rest of the talk. All that lovely stuff, including examples. Anyway, okay, this is what I'm talking about. I'll take it away from language for a moment and say to myself, I'd like to find out about apples. Words are far too difficult. So I've decided, when I retire in a few years' time, probably far too many years' time, 10 years' time or something, I'll look at apples instead. Because I've seen an apple, and I'm going to base all of my theory on apples. I'm going to create this brilliant theory of apples based on this one. And somebody will say, well, actually, I think you're wasting your time with that reality approach to the old apples. I've seen plenty of apples in my time. I'm going to sit back and think about them. I'm going to start to develop these theories of apples based on what I think about apples. Somebody else comes in and says, well, actually, don't look at a real apple. I've got a computational model of an apple. I've built it. Here it is. And you say, okay, quite interesting. Can I bite it? We haven't implemented that yet. What colour is it? That's just a sort of user feature. We're not interested in, okay, I'm not going to work with them, but I can see that they've done some really interesting work in representing apples. Somebody shouts across and says, I've got a heap of apples. Collected them in the garden this morning. You're only studying the one. I've got lots. I look at it and think, well, it's an unordered heap of apples, but it is a heap of apples. I'll give them that much. Maybe I found out a little bit more by looking at that. Somebody else says, you're totally wrong, barking up the wrong tree. You're looking at it as too big an issue. What you need to understand is how apples are constructed. And I've got a microscope, and here are some apple cells, and I'm going to work on how all these cells go together to create the thing that you're looking at. You're looking at totally the wrong level. We need to go down to the building blocks and look at apples at that level. I think, enjoy your microscope and do tell me what you find. Somebody else turns around and says, your one apple ain't going to cut the mustard. And as for that fella thinking about it, I bet he won't think about all the types of apples there are. I've produced an ontology of apples. And actually, through the ontology of apples, I can actually begin to compare in this sort of typological way a whole variety of apples and get deeper insights into apples than any of you ever could. And by the way, tell the cell guy he better take my work into account because the cells could vary across the different types of apple. Oh, right, okay. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, no, no. What you need to do is cut the apples up, chop them in half, look at the internal workings of the apple, because I find that the internal workings of the apple really explain everything. Okay, here we have them, paradigms. People with different worldviews, different approaches to the same basic issue. But where I would never land corpus linguistics myself is in saying that any one of the paradigms is the only one you should ever pursue. I can accept that each of the paradigms may give me insights that the other paradigms wouldn't. The cell chap will tell me about that, and the chap who looks at the insides of the apple is doing something quite distinct from everybody else. The computational models, well, maybe they'll find out something interesting about the mathematical properties of the apple. Who knows? Because at the root of it, I think the reality for the apple, a bit like it is for language, is more like that. Language is socially situated. Through being socially situated, correspondences between form and function develop, for example, just as they do in the case of that apple tree. So we have the apple on the tree, with the leaves, with the tree, with the field it grows in, all the nutrients in the soil, etc. It's an enormously complex question to ask if you say, where does the apple come from? Similarly with language, if you study language, yes, we can abstract away from reality slightly, and we accept we're doing that to get to something I call quasi-reality in the corpus, where we think we've captured language and we have it there, but that's not where language lives. Language lives here in the social world. It's formed by the social world. And that's really where we should look at it. But then the range of variables that are at play are so vast that you're looking at something like that apple tree, when as social scientists, for example, are actually probably working on a paradigm more similar to the ones with I've shown you with those apples there. I do apologise, Robbie, I got so enthusiastic in talking about the things I talked about that I didn't talk about half the things I intended to talk about. But I at least hope that half the things I did talk about were as interesting as the other half that I didn't talk about, and interesting enough to have actually justified an hour of your time listening to me rant away. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just have to get you back again next year to
give the other half, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony.
A bit like one of those Lord of the Rings films.
Much less violent, hopefully, though. Okay, let's take some questions in the room. I think, Mike, did you have a... Yes, go ahead.
What about the serpent and the apple? I mean,
yes.
Really, the apple in our speech and parlance and in our texts has all the things you've got there, but it also has a whole lot of extra stuff.
Yes.
So where does that? I know it's obviously metaphysical, but it comes into text, all right?
Yes, it definitely does. And of course, this is a terrible defence to use. It was in the second half of the talk.
Oh,
there are a series of vexatious issues with what we have in the bag when we look at language. Firstly, the things that aren't in there that we know, we absolutely know have an impact upon what is in there, and we use our own reflections as linguists in order to say, well, actually, I think that sentence looks that way, and I believe that the hearer took this meaning from it because of this chain of inference based on world knowledge, for example. Or performance errors is another serpent that's in the bag. We have to be able to, within our system of belief or our epistemology, explain what we're going to do with performance errors, because I did show in the second half of the talk, you can definitely see them in the BNC 2014, but you can also see people routinely dealing with them. And you can actually see very explicit repairs very often in there as well. So we do actually formulate principles for how we should approach such data and how you might handle things like what are normally called performance errors, but how actually often in corpus linguistics, one of the things that we fail to do when looking at data at a distance, so to speak, is actually accept that some of the data that we are looking at has, in essence, when you look at the text itself, been revoked by the speaker. They say, okay, oh, sorry, I'll start that again. But we count the will, etc., or even little fragments of grammar within it, as though it was actually in some type of warranted sentence from the user and the hearer who say, this makes sense. It didn't, and if you look at the data, it doesn't. You have what we call in situ falsifications. You have the speaker turning around saying, script that, didn't mean it. Or you have the hearer saying, I didn't understand that, have another go. So there are issues there. So there are serpents with the apples, you're absolutely spot on.
Ramesh.
Sort of, I think, following on from what Mike said, because I had a similar sort of little alarm, waking up in my head. When you talk about your principle number 5, and you went back and modified it to add within space and time. Now, in the rest of your talk, you were constantly mentioning the metaphysical, the scientific, and the social reality. Surely that's the other omission here in number 5, is not only within space and time, but within cultural, social context.
Yes.
Which would fit in, Mike's point about the serpent.
Yep, I absolutely agree. So when I say space, it isn't physical space, although physical space may give you an angle on some of these issues. It's more conceptual space. So culture, for example, would be one conceptual space within which we could map language. Variety might be another conceptual space within which we'd map it. So the spaces are conceptual and would cover exactly the types of things that you've identified, because we know that there are productive dimensions along which language will vary, as well as all of those things then varying through time. So actually the situation is massively complex in terms of the variation that we might observe. And certainly in what we've written, we then go back and actually start to question, well, what does probability mean in such a context? We didn't get to that part in the talk, which is my classic defense, but where we start to say, okay, what is the normative in a context like that? Because a lot of reasoning within corpus linguistics is normative. Well, this isn't acceptable because the norm is this, but if actually the norm is hugely varied across a range of dimensions, then you have to ask what the norm is. Sorry, there's a question here.
Yes, my question might be on the wrong horse, off into the wrong direction, but
Gallop away.
Stop thinking about is the link to, I really loved your Apple example because there's so many things to think about, but when we, one element that I keep seeing or going like, where do I put this, is this ethical and moral responsibility towards social justice that inevitably comes with any research and being involved in a very privileged position. Mm-hmm. When we talk about apples, one apple being excluded because a group of people who might be very loud and very powerful group of people say this is not an apple because we decided it doesn't fit our description of an apple. The apple doesn't care, but this changes when we talk about this is not a woman because we decide it's not a woman. How do we pay tribute to that, and how do we actually acknowledge our power that we have there and our responsibility that comes with it?
Yes.
Because that's something I keep going in circles and getting angry and frustrated, to be honest.
I can't comment on your specific example because it's not an area I work in and I'll stumble and get it all wrong. But what I can say at the more abstract level is this. The concerns you have are right because we're making active decisions when we're generating, for example, I think this is the case you're talking about, ontologies. So you're going to say, well, we're going to break people into these groups, and these properties will put people in this little box here, this little box there. And ontologies are often approached as being sort of theory-free or socially free of social consequence. They're not valued judgments, but of course they are. So even in linguistics, we can think of categorization schemes where we might argue that there's some type of powers at play. So, for example, if I produce some type of categorization of an English sentence or break it apart somehow and assume the case exists, and actually hidden below the system of English there is a system of case because Latin had case, and all of our theories of grammar are based on Latin, so we'll apply a Latinate approach to the analysis of this language, even though we know that it lacks some of those features as explicitly marked in the grammar. Then you see sort of this sort of approach that you're talking about coming through, a powerful language, historically powerful, still influencing the analysis that we might produce of a language now which may not be best approached through that way. So I think that thinking about the assumptions that we're making when we generate ontologies and we classify is extremely important, and we should be as clear about it as possible. And also, and I think this touches on something else you've made, we shouldn't chatter on about this a bit in what we've written, make dogmatic defenses where you turn around and say, I'm an expert, shut up, you're stupid. That type of thing. Which, of course, some linguists have made a career out of almost. Turning around and saying, you're just flat wrong, this is untrue. And we give a very nice example in what we've written of a conversation between Chomsky and Carol Hatcher, where she catches him out on a grammatical point. And he says, well, if anybody says that, they don't speak English. And then later on in the conversation, she gives him a felicitous example, and he says, oh, special things, and moves away from it very quickly, rather than actually saying, yes, you're right, or do people say that? How would we find out? So yes, dogmatism isn't a very good scientific strategy, but it is a very good strategy for the defense of a paradigm. Yeah.
Okay. I know there are more questions, but I would like to wrap things up, and perhaps you can...
Oh, people can write to me.
And write to you, yes, absolutely. So we could talk all night about this, I'm sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, people on Zoom.
Indeed.